Okay. And let me get her rolling here. All righty, let's do a check. Can you see the first slide of I'm showing here? Someone say yes, please.
No.
I'm going to
No?
say no.
Okay, thanks. That's why I ask. And I know why. I forgot to share. And we will try that again.
Yes.
Now we're up.
And now you're up full screen? Okay. So Lori just mentioned something which is true of me too. Most of my presentations, I take my scans from exhibits that I've made in the past. In fact, most of what you're seeing today is an exhibit that I did about 10 years ago.
Steve,
And
pardon me, you're in presentation mode. You're not in full screen mode. You're in the presenter mode. We have the first slide and then your next slide up.
Yeah, I was just going
Okay.
to say the same thing.
How about now?
There we go. That looks right.
I had to swap screens, thanks. So like I was starting to say, is this used to be an exhibit, and I have more or less updated it for the past 10 years that occurred since I did the exhibit. So you're going to see some newer covers. I'm not sure the title is exactly right, but I'm trying to show something about how naval cover collecting came into being and what we collect today. Talk about cancels, caches, societies, postal history, and some world event impacts, all of which I think have impacted naval cover history. Back in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet around the world. And along the way, sailors are welcomed in all the different ports. And in some of the ports, they made postcards. And in Japan, they made not only postcards, but they made some cancels. This is a cancel from, on the left, it's a Tokyo cancel, a little hard to see. And on the right, it's a Yokohama cancel. So I think these are probably the first cancels that ever existed that actually said something about the American Naval Fleet, 1908. Also in 1908, Congress authorized post offices aboard ships. And that's when naval cancels were born. They did that in the summer of 1908. It took until November of 1908. The USS Mayflower was the first ship to actually use cancels. The two you're looking at here are both December 1908 and Independence and to Philadelphia. Both of these are pretty rare covers, R3 rated, which means there's probably about 10 copies of these. That's kind of what got us on our trek for collecting cancels. Here's another one from the USS Washington, also December 1908. And once we had post offices aboard ships, this is kind of what I call our first inflection point in our collecting. It's people started sending, sailors and officers started sending mail from ships. People started saving it. And today, these are some of the cards that we collect now that are over 100 years old. USS California and a Battleship North Dakota postcard here. And believe it or not, I have found evidence of somebody collecting as early as 1911. I think normally we think of probably some of the first collectors coming around in the 20s, you know, the Harry Klotzbachs and the Loseys and Dr. Evans, but there's an Edward Bridge, who I know absolutely nothing about, sent for covers or sent for cancellations. And this postcard was sent by him. It's sent back from a mail clerk aboard the USS Glacier. And he is saying, as the USS Marblehead no longer cancels stamps, we'll have to send you one. So Mr. Bridge must have sent it to the Marblehead, and then that got sent over to the Glacier. I do not know if it'll please you or not, but here it is. So there's a very nice cancel, which today we call an R1 rated cancel. There's maybe 100 copies of this. So there was somebody, at least one person, collecting naval covers way back in 1911. And it's just to ensure that wasn't a fluke, you can see here that he sent off for a cancel from the USS Princeton and simply got a cancel on the back, as well as a cancel mailing the postcard. Another pretty rare cancel, R3 rated, one of 10 copies. We call this period the classics today, you know, from 1908 up through World War I-ish. We call that the classics period. Very rare cover here from the USS Newport, which at the time was the New York State Marine School. The cancellation reads NYSS, New York State School. This one is an R4 rated copy, one of 5 copies. And then, of course, World War I comes around and mail starts getting generated by more and more sailors. The bottom cover is from the USS Pueblo, 1917. You can see it was franked in accordance with a particular act which allowed the sailors to mail their stuff for free. And this was passed by censor in a nice type F cancel. And I think many of us have probably seen this cover, but it's a very early collectible cover made for collectors. It mentions a submarine USS C3. And while the cancellation sort of looks like it may have been done on the C3, it was not, but it was carried through the Panama Canal. Cancel on the left is from Balboa Heights. Cancel on the right is the other side of the canal at Cristobal. Certainly an early collectible, and people were obviously collecting right around the World War I time here. Then along comes the good old Navy Savings Bank. And I suspect probably all of us have at least 1 or 2 covers in our collections to the Navy Savings Bank. It's a place sailors could send their money to go into a bank account. A guy named Admiral Williams owned the Navy Savings Bank building, and his son was apparently a collector. So the Admiral, having son pull, told the bank, "Save your covers, and I'm going to give them to my son." His son was C.S. Williams, and in this way, he acquired a huge collection of Navy Savings Bank mail. The one on the left rather is a very rare one, USS Sands, also an R4 rated cover. The bottom cover is from the receiving ship at Philadelphia. And if it wasn't for Admiral Williams saving all those covers for his son, there's a lot of ships we probably wouldn't have cancels from today. So it was a great way for collectors to get covers. Another one from the Navy Savings Bank. And during the 20s, collectors had this brilliant idea that they would, rather than save entire envelopes, to save space, they would cut squares. So they would cut the cancel off the envelope, which didn't do a lot for us today because that's not how we like to collect covers. But you can still find some very rare cut square cancels, this one being a USS Oregon R3 rated cancel. And as we get into the 20s, you do start to recognize some of the names that we know as collectors today. Dr. Evans, run into his covers quite a bit. If you attended my LOSI talk, Dr. Evans was one of the guys who was proposing a very early classification system. It didn't pan out, but he was trying to find a way to classify cancels. LOSI built on that and made his own system, which is what we use today. The bottom cover, if you're a movie fanatic, you may recognize the name William Hornbeck. Hornbeck was a film editor. And if around Christmas time you ever watch It's a Wonderful Life and watch the credits, you'll see Hornbeck's name roll through as film editing. Hornbeck received an Oscar and apparently was a collector. Again, if you're a movie fanatic, you can recognize his address as the long extinct Mac Sennett Studio in Hollywood. A couple other early collectors whose name you may recognize are Everett Earl. a guy here in the Bay Area who collected a little bit of everything, but he certainly collected naval covers. And Harry Smuckler. Harry was a collector for a long time. In fact, later in this presentation, I have a Smuckler cover. And if I remember right, it's postmarked in the 70s, whereas this one's postmarked late 20s. So he was a longtime collector. Harry Klotzbach, I mentioned that name earlier. Probably many of you recognize his covers. Again, an early collector, and he sent for cancels. And again, that's why we have some of the cancels. We have some ships in the late 20s. It's because of Harry Klotzbach. A neat cover from the USS Raleigh with a neat cancellation. Pretty rare cancel, R3 rated. And then we kind of hit another inflection point. This is probably the first commercial cover with a naval cover with a cachet on it. 1928. Good old A.C. Roessler, the guy who was infamous for some of his airmail work, also did some naval covers, and he created this one with a cancellation. President Hoover was taking a goodwill tour of South and Central America, and that's what this cover commemorates. But it's probably the first naval cover with a cachet. Talked a little bit about a classification system. So we hit the late 20s. Losey was working on his system in 1928. He and Doc Evans were both sending for covers. They were trading covers. They were starting to collect a list, which would eventually become a catalog of ships which had different cancellations. And we sort of hit our next inflection point in 1929 with the article that Dr. Losey published in the APS journal, U.S. Navy Ship Cancellations, February 1929. And now we had an article out there in the Philatelic Press talking about naval cancels and showing his classification system and starting to give the hobby some more widespread publicity. There was a club here in the Bay Area called the North Bay Stamp Club. And while that may sound like it was just a Bay Area type club, it really wasn't. It was certainly a national club. It was a club for people who not only collected stamps, but it was for a group of people who collected naval covers. Harry Klotzbach was a member, Dr. Losey was a member, and M.M. Gray was a member, and good old Crosby. Crosby was a member of the North Bay Stamp Club. They started sponsoring cachets for ships being launched at Mare Island. And here's another early cachet. USS V6 submarine was commissioned at Mare Island in 1930, and they prepared this cachet, which was used on covers. Some of you may have some George Rohraback covers. They're fairly common. They're usually fairly inexpensive because there's nothing particularly rare about them. But George became the director of the Naval Postmark Unit of the International Postal Marking Society. So our hobby starts to spread out and specialize a little bit. The IPMS was founded, I believe it was 1912, for people who collected postmarks. Well, naval cover collectors are collecting postmarks at the time, so they specialized in this. George's covers are very recognizable. He always tended to write the ship name and classification and some dates up in the upper left-hand corner, just like this cover has. Sort of his own cachet talking about the ship, even though it was written by pen. 1930. North Bay Stamp Club, like I said, was getting into the act with naval covers. They actually made a cancel from a gum eraser, which they walked down to the USS Talbot, which was in Mare Island, and it was used a couple of occasions to cancel covers. Fred Baumgartner, another name you may recognize. I seem to run into his covers every now and then. Most are fairly common covers. This one is not. The submarine USS Narwhal got a cancel, and the person who made it misspelled it. And so instead of narwhal, it's harwal with an H. It was used for a very short period, not canceling very many covers. This is one of 25. I mentioned MM Gray earlier, early collector, a nice USS V5 cover. This is an example of an early collector trick. If you note who this cover is addressed to, it's addressed to Sodom and Gomorrah. As you might figure out, probably isn't a real person. The trick was you address your cover to a name like something like that didn't exist, or maybe at an address that didn't exist. It would go through the postal system. The post office on the far side would try to deliver it, find out Mr. Gomorrah really didn't live on High Life Way, and so it would get returned to the sender. So we have a nice cover here marking the commissioning of the USS Chicago. On the back, we have the Chicago back stamps to prove it went through the mail, and we have the big purple finger on the cover showing its return to sender. Early collector trick. We had a friend and a yeoman aboard the USS Brooks, Charles Alasky. Charles Alasky was the ship's writer, and he helped sponsor cancellations from the destroyer USS Brooks, most of which featured historical events in the killer bars. This one is marking an anniversary of the cruise of the Saginaw gig. The Saginaw was the first ship built at Mare Island. It wrecked in the Pacific, and a couple of the crew members were able to take the gig and sail, I've forgotten how many hundreds or thousands of miles, back to civilization and let people know that, hey, the rest of the crew was out there on this deserted island, and this cover is marking that. You also may note that this is addressed to Herb Rommel, and most of you may recognize that name. Early cover collector. In fact, this is very early, 1932. He later became a USCS president. He was also aboard the USS Oklahoma on December 7th. Alasky went on, just for your information, stayed in the Navy. He was captured in the Philippines at the beginning of World War II, survived through a POW camp, was released, and eventually became a captain in the USS Navy. So he went from yeoman all the way up to captain. Old Ironsides. We all know Old Ironsides. She made a trip from the East Coast to the West Coast. And as she stopped in every port, there were cancellations in every port. Lots of covers got canceled. In fact, as a matter of fact, it's said that there were over 4 million covers canceled during that cruise. So a lot of people were exposed to naval cover collecting through the cruise of the USS Constitution or Old Ironsides. I mentioned the IPMS earlier. LOCI was also a member of this. So George Rohrbach may have been the director of the cancellation group in here, but LOCI was a member. LOCI sent a letter as he was moving from station to station. Here he was en route to Haiti, and he put a little sticker on to show he was an IPMS member. If you attended my LOCI talk, you may recognize the name C.S. Nolson. Nolson was the guy who would purchase the LOCI collection when it went up for auction after LOCI's death. And as we get to 1932, the society we all belong to was formed, USCS, October 1932. This is not a 1932 cover, but I like it because it certainly features our logo very well and a motto that existed at the time, to be of service to as many as possible. So now we have a society for collectors. And in fact, within 3 years, there are 2 societies. In 1935, a name we all know also, D.C. Bartley, and a name we may not know, but Marshall Hall Both were running for the presidency of the USCS. They had big differences of opinions. Bartley won the election. Hall said, "I've had enough." And Hall and some of his friends went off and formed a new society called the American Naval Council Society, ANCS. They were very interested in caches, had no real interest in cancels. They liked naval covers, but they were most interested in caches and their groups. In the USCS, we call them chapters. Their groups, we call them crews. Their crews made a lot of different caches, as we'll see in some of my illustrations. There's an early membership card for an RM Sprague in the ANCS. Also early 30s, as people were starting to collect and getting more and more interested in joining societies, Joseph Hale and Everett Walster started publishing a magazine called the Seapost Collector. And this was strictly for naval covers or maritime cover collectors. It cost all of 50 cents a year, but it had nice articles about collecting, and it included covers for shales. And what becomes the first naval cover postmark catalog. Joe Hale put this out. He and Everett Walster published it. It was all of $1, as you can see. 100 pages long, 5x8 catalog. This is the grandfather of what today we call the USCS Catalog of Naval Postmarks. So we're still in the 30s, but you can see really things have heated up as we get into the 30s. There's now a couple societies, there's different collectors, there's publications. Things have really grown from, say, 1908. I included another old Ironsides cover here just because if you see whose name is in the cachet, you see York Burdell and Alfred Newman, which were USCS members 1 and 2. Nice, attractive cachet. Just an attractive cachet. Christmas time, canceled aboard the USS Nautilus. PJ Ickeringgill, who was one of the charter members of the USCS. He was member 4. He did this design. PJ is in the USCS Hall of Fame. And Walter Crosby comes along. His first cover is appearing in around 1930. He's producing naval covers and first day covers. This is a very attractive one, sort of timely. It's for the 10th Olympiad, Summer Olympics. Last day in Los Angeles, canceled aboard the battleship Pennsylvania. Crosby would sponsor covers until his death in 1947. This is one of his covers, probably a little more familiar looking to most of you. This one has the stamp removed, which sort of ruins it as a cover, but on the other hand, it shows you what's underneath the stamp you would normally see. And then copyright applied for by W.G. Crosby and his post office box in San Pedro. I mentioned the ANCS and their crews. Probably another thing many of us have is at least one cachet from the Argonaut crew. They did some very attractive covers, cachets. They did hand coloring for the members of the crew. If you were not a member of the crew and you were buying one of these covers from them, it would not be hand colored. So these are two attractive ones that were just made for crew members. Carl Lewis, a famous artist, painted covers. He painted not only naval covers, but merchant ship covers, and usually some connection to Japan, which is where he lived. This is, to me, it's a very beautiful cover. You can see his name on the back in the right-hand side. In the 30s were a time of a lot of people getting into making covers. Hand-painted covers became popular. Handmade, such as the bottom one, which is really a collage, became popular. Irene Griffith did the Mississippi cover, and Helen Dye did the Valentine's Day cover. Henry Steinmetz, also a first day cover collector, but he was into naval covers too. His covers are usually recognizable by either stickers that he may have used or a background to the stamp. If you look at the two center, you can see there's a red background, and he also tended to put little triangles on the covers, corners. And on this particular cover, he's actually wrapped it in Christmas paper. So the purple wrapping is a Christmas wrapper. A lot of things going on in the 30s for collectors. This has to have been a collector-inspired cancellation. You know, it's a very nice cancel. One of 25 copies, so it's fairly uncommon, but it's just a beautiful flag cancellation marking the last day of commission for the USS Rochester. This is a non-philatelic cover, but mailed by somebody who was obviously some sort of stamp collector, getting a USS Vega cancellation with lots of stamps of the period. Another guy who was making hand-painted or covers in the 30s, Oscar Hingsler. His cachets are recognized as being printed on photographic paper and then hand-painted like this one. A guy named J.N. Lawrence, another name many of you may recognize, did a lot of cachets, got into the act of making a collectible. He was stationed in the Asiatic Fleet in the Shanghai area, and he made several covers. About a half dozen different ships canceled his covers. This one's from the gunboat Panay, and his cachet area has what are real stamps and what were purported to be cancellations from those ships. Well, the cancels are fake, the stamps are real, but they certainly make a nice collectible cover. Somebody here in the 30s took some wallpaper, folded it up, made an envelope, and got a naval cover out of it for the last day of commission of the USS Tarbell.
Oh, thank you.
Don't
Right.
see very,
Oh,
don't see.
thank you. How you doing? Is yours done? Still going
I
on?
got some, but yeah, it's getting long. I can't sit in.
Can somebody please mute themselves? Thank you. Don't see very many inauguration covers on naval covers, but somebody named Leo Seitz did a hand-drawn cover marking FDR's second inauguration here. Gao Ing, another name that probably most of us recognize, did lots of hand-drawn covers, usually for sub-events, though there are a few destroyer events that he marked. He would usually do 25 to 50 covers per event, drawing the same design over and over and over again and hand coloring them. Cover on the left is marking the USS Squalus being raised to the surface after she had sunk. Cover on the right is just a commissioning cover for the USS Swordfish. There's some really nice, pretty, attractive cachets. Again, we're still in the 30s. And there was overlap. First day cover collecting was also becoming popular in the 30s, and cachets on first day covers were certainly becoming popular. And there was overlap between people collecting first day cancels and collecting naval covers. So you see here a Crosby cover that was designed for a first day cover of the Army Navy series, canceled aboard a Navy ship, making it an unofficial unofficial first day cover. The bottom one is an art craft cover. Actually, this was the site of the first day cancel for first day of issue for this stamp aboard the USS Charleston in the Canal Zone. And a little bit of collector fun. Somebody came up with a cancel for the Jacob Jones, except they printed it as the USS Jack Jones. Not allowed, certainly not per regulation. This is one of 10 known copies. And on the back, you can see the people who were involved, Joe Cole, Willison, and Taze Nicholson. Taze is a name who you may recognize, got into covers in the 30s, was still doing covers in the 80s. Long time resident of Norfolk and was able to get a lot of cancellations. We'll see a couple of his covers as we go on. D.C. Bartley, talked about him a little earlier. He reportedly serviced over 1 million covers during his sponsorship years. Just a plain attractive cachet on the upper for the launching of the Patterson and the Jarvis. The bottom one is a kind of neat cover. It is not marking the new airmail series. That was years before 1941, but it's got a neat cancellation that's from the USS Lexington. And there were still societies being formed. 1939, the Naval Shore Station Cancellation Society, another society for collectors of cancels. And while the name says Shore Station, if you read their newsletters, it also included information on ships. This is a first day of cancel for the Alameda Naval Air Station here in the Bay Area. Hand-painted covers were very popular in the 30s and just before the war. These are two from the USS Cherokee, Dunbar cover and a Gladys Adler cover. The Dunbar cover, I guess in hindsight, you'd have to say is a little bit optimistic because peace certainly was not assured in 1940. War was already going on in Europe, and we all know it would happen in about a year for the United States. And that really kind of gets us to our next inflection point. War broke out for the US in December 1941, and it changed cover collecting. Many of our collectors who were from the 30s were either out joining the service or joining the workforce and just simply stopped collecting. Ships were no longer servicing covers. They had better things to do with their time, like fight a war, than service covers. So big change just came with December 7th. Most of the event covers that were so very popular during the 30s pretty much stopped during the war. This is probably a last Mare Island event cover for the launching of the submarine USS Whale. Nice Martin Aden cachet, and someone has hand colored this one, makes this one pretty unique. George Sadworth was making some cachets during the war. This one postmarked aboard the USS Marlin. Another name of interest that you may or may not recognize, Jim Russell. Jim was a USCS member. He was primarily a cancellation collector. So even though he was in the service, and you can see he was stationed in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, when he sent for this cancel, he used V postcards to send off to ships trying to get cancels. And he got a cancel here from the destroyer escort Fremont. Jim was, like I said, in USCS, very much an expert on cancellations. Another sort of rare event cover during the war, launching of the carrier USS Shangri-La in 44. But the war brought us something else, and sailors were mailing stuff home all the time, lots of letters. We get some postal history being generated out of World War II, which we collect today. This is from a pilot aboard the Squadron VB-8 aboard the USS Hornet. This was posted a day before the Hornet sailed for Midway. So within about a week, the ship and Ensign Freese would be involved in the Battle of Midway. And the war sort of affected the plans of the hobby shop. This was a hobby shop in a department store in Rochester, New York, who had come up with the idea just before the war to start selling naval covers. They made some very attractive cachets, But by the time they got around for sending for cancels, they found that ships weren't going to return their cancels, their covers. So rather than throw away a bunch of stuff, they decided they'd make fake cancels. So this is a cancel from the USS Luzon, or at least it looks like it. Turns out this is a fake, never went anywhere near the ship. And somebody named Glenn Dye, another name we may recognize. A true collector. He was also in the Navy. This shows he was stationed on the YMS 111 at the time, but he decided to make his own cancels. So what looks like a cancellation from the YMS 111 is really nothing more than a cover and a rubber stamp that he applied. I mentioned Taze Nicholson, living in Norfolk, working at the Navy Yard. There's a cover he got in March of 42. Any of you familiar with the battleship USS Kentucky? Would have been BB 66. You may not be familiar with it because it didn't end up being completed. This was the keel laying in 42, but somewhere along the line it got scrapped when the Navy decided they didn't need another battleship like that. Bottom covers also from Taze, canceled aboard the USS Hunter Liggett. And on the back of it, Taze had written, "I went aboard and had this canceled." So we know how this cover was created. And as the war ended, the Navy gathered in Tokyo Bay for a surrender ceremony. It was also a means for the Navy ships that were there to actually create covers for their sailors and their crew that would become collectibles for them. Well, today we collect them too. This is a nice one showing the first mail from the USS Cumberland Sound, August 28th, 45. Ships had just gone into Tokyo Bay at that time. This is a little bit after the surrender ceremony, the 22nd. Surrender ceremony was on the 2nd. This is a nice cachet from the carrier USS Independence. And Navy Day 45 was quite an event. It was an event for the public, an event for the Navy, also an event for cover collectors. It was the first day that named cancels were authorized aboard ship again. It was also the first day of issue for the Navy postal stamp. So here you're looking at actually two unofficial first day covers, since neither the Missouri or Ellicomon were official sites, but they canceled them on the date of the issue of this stamp. It's a Walt Lupton cachet and a Flugel cachet. So we get into the later 40s, Operation High Jump presented an opportunity for cover collectors to go out and get covers. This is a really neat one, a unique one. It's said that the Mount Olympus serviced at least 150,000 covers on this January 10th date, 1947. USCS was still around. They resumed having conventions in 46. This is a convention cover from 49, their fourth convention. This is an application for the USCS from 1948. You may recognize the name Bertha Thompson. She was president during the war and is generally credited with keeping the society going, since there were so few members and everybody was off fighting a war. The ANCS had gone defunct in 46. Good old Glenn Dye with his fake cancels. He and the editor of the ANCS publication had a run-in, and the society pretty much folded up at that point. I'm not exactly sure what this cover is. It says 15th anniversary convention in 1950. The society didn't exist in 1950, so it's probably another Glenn Dye fake, or else an attempt to think he's going to revive the society. And a very late ANCS cancellation application there at the bottom. One thing we see with covers in the 40s are the hand-painted, the handmade covers that we saw in the 30s are pretty much gone. Those collectors have not come back to naval cover collecting after the war. some of the very nice artwork that we saw in the 30s really hasn't come back. Generally, the 40s cliches seem to be rather plain, in my opinion. There were some fancy cancels being used. In fact, each of these has a fancy cancel. But to me, the artwork just isn't the same. The guys doing the artwork from the 30s didn't come back into the hobby. A couple more from the 40s. And then we were back at war again, Korean War. Certainly the Navy had a presence off Korea fighting in the war, but we find very, very few philatelic covers from the war. This is an unusual one. When you were in wartime waters in the Navy or as a serviceman on the land, you were able to send letters for free. This is actually marking the last day of free mail in the Korea theater for the USS Leyte. So she was probably rotating back to Japan, but somebody aboard and the Ensign Schultz, Robert Schultz was his name, created this cover, and we have a neat philatelic cover from the Korean War. Bodish was a collector. There are a few Task Force 77 covers canceled aboard different ships during the war. And Chuck French, you may know the name, longtime USCS member. He was aboard the USS Bairoko. He made a nice cover for the end of the Korean War, 1953. And the Korean War is another place to start generating letters from sailors and officers back home. And so we get some postal history that we collect today. Cover from the USS Valley Forge and USS Consolation. If we head into the 50s, covers still seemed to be pretty plain in my opinion. Again, the fancy, nice artwork just didn't come back, but there were certainly people collecting and certainly people sending off for naval cancels. Duke Kameli bought many of the Walter Crosby designs and reused them. He's reused one here as a St. Patrick's Day cover in '54, except he missed the cancel date. Cancel date's 26th instead of the 17th. And also as we hit the mid 50s, these things called nuclear subs start being built, giving collectors a new opportunity to get some covers from keel layings, launchings, and commissionings. This one is a keel laying for the USS Sargo, first nuclear sub built at Mare Island. Some of you may know the name Ray Costa. Ray would become a USCS president in 1968. There was a collector event in '59. 28 ships sailed through the St. Lawrence waterway into the Great Lakes. And there was special cachet for that. This is one with a corner card from the sub Sablefish canceled aboard the destroyer USS Alt. A very collectible cover, though it wasn't made for collectors, was one from the USS Nautilus when she went under the North Pole. 1,570 covers were made to mark the event. It was for crew members and other people. They used a postmark that day. They used a two-piece cachet. And as I said, these are very collectible today. Post office got into the act and they fired a missile, a Regulus missile with some mail aboard. Sent it from the USS Barbaro, a sub. And then they mostly took the mail that was aboard and they sent it to different dignitaries, senators, representatives, and that such and so on. Wasn't really meant for collectors, but certainly we find this to be a very collectible cover today. 3,000 of them were prepared. When cover collectors did find out about it, they said, hey, can we get more Barbaro cancels on our own covers? And the answer was no. So that helps to make these fairly collectible. Another collectible cover for us today was from USS Triton. Triton made the first submerged trip around the world, 1960. And as nuclear subs started doing things like that, they became cover collectibles for us. This was a USS Sea Dragon, first Northwest Passage transit, postmarked in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, with the other postmark in Nome, Alaska. And I mentioned nuke subs. Again, a big cover event for collectors. Probably brought some people into the hobby that weren't into the hobby before. A gold craft cover for the launching of the USS George Washington, the first ballistic missile sub. And the lower cover is Morris Beck's very first cachet, marking the launching of the Thomas Jefferson. Commissioning cover for the USS Scorpion, in a collectible cover. Mentioned launch covers became things we could all collect. This one is a launch cover for the USS Dace, signed by the sponsor, Betty Ford, somebody whose name you probably recognize. Collectors started sending off their covers. This is from the USS Triton, signed by Commander Rawlins. You may know the name Bob Rawlins. He was our longtime editor of the log before Richard took over. And shipyards started producing their cachets for some of the ships that were being launched. This is a sea trial cachet for the nuclear destroyer USS Bainbridge. So now we're into the 60s. The space program was another inflection point. It brought a lot of people into the hobby. If you think back to the early 60s, the space program was a big deal for people. If you were a kid, you probably remember watching some of those early space flights, getting up to watch launches on TV. If you're old enough, maybe even you remember, what a big deal learning about the astronauts were, and even about the astronauts' wives, Life magazine and all that good stuff. Well, there were also covers being made that would tie into the space program. The upper cover is a recovery of the BIOS 1, something I'm not familiar with. In fact, I could find very little about it researching it. It was a biological investigation of space. The bottom is a captain's cover. These were made for crew members, and this was the splashdown of Gemini 12, which had astronauts Jim Lovell and Buzz Aldrin aboard. A couple other space covers. Nice one for Mercury 7, Scott Carpenter's splashdown, and Faith 7, Gordon Cooper's splashdown. The recovery forces were out there. We could get covers from them. This is when a lot of people came into the hobby, as I mentioned. In fact, USCS would see a big growth in membership as we go through the space program. 1975, we would actually see our peak membership. And if you think back to the space program, it's kind of early 70s when the space program started coming to an end. And some of the collectors that had joined at that time also started getting out of the hobby. At the top, we have one of the covers I sent for way back in 1972, Apollo 16 splashdown. Bottom cover is a Skylab 3 recovery. And we continue to send for covers if you were interested in that at the time. Probably a lot easier to get covers back then than it is today. One of mine I sent for the USS America. And I mentioned the name Henry Smuckler earlier. Back in the 30s, here he is. I guess it's a 66, so at least 30 years later, he's still collecting and sending for covers. I mentioned how the nuke sub program really got us into covers. A lot of covers being created. Unfortunately, they're not too valuable nowadays, but a lot of colorful, pretty cachets being made at the time. There's a Beck cover and a Bob Rawlins cover. Bob made a few covers. This is one of my favorite cachet designs. I just happen to like it. It features the long line of ships that was built at Mare Island from the start of the with the USS Saginaw, continuing through the nuclear attacks of the USS Drum in 1970. And it was during this time another world event got us a chance to collect some covers. Vietnam War. We had a Navy off the coast of Vietnam, flying a lot of air missions, bombing North Vietnam, South Vietnam. A lot of sailors and officers sending mail home. So we collect some of that real mail today. Launch cover signed by Barbara Bush, USS Houston. And USCS was around, celebrating the 50th anniversary in '82. This cover was signed by 4 early charter members, number 19, number 20, and number 40. 40 being Joe Hale. I have to mention Rich Hoffner. Rich has made probably well over 1,500 designs, probably more like 2,000 maybe at this point in time. Certainly brought a lot of collectors into the hobby and has kept a lot of collectors in the hobby. Mentioned Taze Nicholson several times. Here's a cover from his 1984. Welcome to Norfolk, USS Daniel Boone. And you may remember when the not the US, but the plane Voyager made the first nonstop flight around the world with Dick Rutan and Gina Yeager. And I'm not quite sure what the USS McKee had to do with that, if anything, but it's a very attractive cachet and a naval cover. And people were sending for covers still. Here's a 1960 cover, 75 cover. You might note that's from Jim Russell, the same guy who was trying to get cancels during World War II. 1980 cover, 1990 cover. So we're still collecting. And world events generated more opportunities for covers collectors. Desert Storm, Desert Shield. We had a naval presence over there. A couple covers from ships that were there, the USS Philippine Sea and the USS Nassau. And cover collectors got into the act. Truman Botar created the cover at top with Saddam Hussein there. And Roger Wentworth created the bottom cover, USS Mount Vernon, Operation Desert Storm. The Bird chapter sent for a number of covers using the same cachet, but canceled aboard different ships. Here's a cover from the USS Missouri. Pounding Basra, January 16th, 1991 is what the rubber stamp says. More world events, Operation Restore Hope in Somalia. We had the carrier Ranger over there. Operation Joint Forge. Seems like all these operations kind of blend together now, but this was one to try to bring peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And again, we had the Navy over there. These two covers are sort of interesting. I mentioned how when you're in a war zone, you get free postal franking. This is mailed, each cover mailed by the same person. The one on the left mailed on June 18th, required postage. And 11 days later, the ship had to be in the war zone because the mail is free franked. To me, this is a big inflection point for us. Had nothing to do with covers, but I think it affected all of our lives, and that was the internet came along. What used to be us going to libraries or sending off to the National Archives for information suddenly became going on the internet, we could do research. I wonder if any of you remember the hazegray.org site. I know this was the first one I found. I think it was created in '94, but they started publishing some of the DANF write-ups online. In 1995 to To me, this is a big deal for collectors. eBay came along. Think of what most of us do today, and I'm sure all of us have probably bought at least one cover off of eBay, if not hundreds. Used to be we'd have to go to a stamp show, or we'd have to do a online, or not an online, but a postal auction. Now we can go to eBay and we can see a cover, we can see what it looks like, and we can bid on it very, very easily. To me, that affected our hobby quite a bit. And computers. Computers came along. Somebody mentioned they didn't like Apple, but Apple computers came along, the early Macintoshes, and made making caches very, very easy. This is a very nice Steve Kovacs cache made by computer. This is an Al Eckert cache made on his computer. People started taking pictures. There were now color printers that did a wonderful job, and you could make your own caches. You didn't have to go to a printer and probably order 100 or 200 envelopes printed up to make it a reasonable cost. You could make them one at a time now if you wanted to. And I think, again, because of the advent of the internet becoming popular for everybody and accessible for everybody, and things like eBay being accessible, postal history became a little more popular among naval cover collectors. Used to be you'd go to a dealer and you'd ask for a box of naval covers, and they were probably pretty much all cached covers. Things like this one here, which is a postal history cover, probably wasn't in a naval box. But now it's pretty easy to find things like this on eBay. This is a cover from the receiving ship USS Independence, which was housed at Mare Island, 1891 cover. Again, an eBay find. This is an 1849 cover addressed to a midshipman aboard the Razee Independence, the same Independence I just talked about on the last cover. It went to the forwarding agent at the U.S. Naval Lyceum in New York, found the midshipman was no longer aboard the Independence, and it was forwarded on to him aboard the USS Erie. Kind of a neat cover. More postal history, another hard to find ship sometimes, USS Mohican. And there were a lot of polar covers from the 1990s. Here we see the Sandlance doing a under the pole voyage during ISEX 1996. Talked about computers a little bit earlier. By the late 90s, early 2000s, people were really starting to do a lot of add-on caches. Top one is a Bruce Liddell add-on. The bottom is a Dave Kent add-on. Dave told me that he used to send for covers in the 80s, didn't put caches on them, but he thought that someday there would be computers that would allow him to do so. So he had a stockpile of covers ready to add caches once the computer technology caught up with him. Another world event, Navy over there fighting anti-terrorism, 2003, a Dan Goodwin cache. Nice Bill Everett cache. Another computer one by Patricia Richmond as we get into the 2000s. Dave Curtis made some the old-fashioned way. Very attractive cache. USS George H.W. Bush christening, autographed by President George Bush, 2006. The Navy got into the act and they created a council for the centennial of naval aviation in 2011. This is Roger Wentworth cache. Roger kept sending for covers. These are a couple of his St. Patrick's Day covers that he made for me. Canceled aboard his favorite ship, the USS Roosevelt. We may remember just from a few years back, a certain president calling our friend over in North Korea Rocket Man. Roger made a nice event cover for that, as the USS Theodore Roosevelt was in the Sea of Japan during the time. Doug Ebert's made some nice hand-colored cliches. Again, a world event. The USS Ross was launching cruise missiles at a Syrian air base in 2017. And as we get very close to today, Al Eckert, a very attractive printed computer generated cachet, marking an anniversary of the USS Chicago. A neat Phil Schreiber cachet, really marking the signs of the time. Fleet Week was canceled due to COVID-19 in 2021. What's our next inflection point in our hobby? No idea. Good question. We know USCS is going to turn 100 in 10 more years. 2032 will be 100. Certainly, we have fewer ships that have post offices today than we did even 10 years ago. All those literal ships that we're adding, the LCSs, they don't have post offices. So certainly fewer opportunities to get cancels from ships. But we now have at least 120 years of naval covers for sale and for collecting. So we got a lot of stuff out there. Who's going to fill the shoes of some of the names, like the Rich Hoffners, the Taze Nicholsons? Who's the next generation that's going to come on? Don't know. Certainly, I think we would all know and all think that the only constant is change. I agree with that statement, and we're going to see some change, and we're going to see an evolution of naval cover collecting. Don't know what it'll be, but something's going to come up. And as I usually end my presentations, go to www.uscs.org for more. Enjoy what you collect what you enjoy, and have fun collecting. And thank you.
Wonderful, Steve. This is great.
Great.
Super.
Thank you.
I have to admit, I loved seeing one that said canceled due to COVID. It's something that brings it very much into where we are right now.
Yep.
Steve, on
Yeah,
that
Peter?
voyage, on the Voyager cover,
Yeah.
you wondered what the connection was to the McKee.
Yeah.
The guy who did that cover was Bruce Speed,
Yes.
and he was
I
a
knew that.
McKee, he was a McKee sailor.
I did not. I knew Bruce did the cachet, but I didn't know
Yeah.
that connection. Okay.
He did about a half a dozen cachets, all canceled on McKee. Rich Hoffner and I tried to figure out where he went to a while back. Most of them have his home address on it. Turns out that's a house in Navy housing here in San Diego. And he has disappeared into the fog of time.
Yeah.
I belong to the McKee Facebook page. I was embarked in McKee for 3-4 years. And he's never showed up on the Facebook, on the crew page. If he ever does, I'm going to drop him a line and say, whatever happened to you?
Oh, thanks for that. Didn't know that.
You're welcome.
Steve, that was just another amazing presentation for someone relatively new to the professional side of this hobby. I mean, having seeing the history and everything that you've put together in that presentation, it not only, do you have a wealth of knowledge and experience, but boy, what a great presentation. So thank you. I have one very small question, and that is, you mentioned what happened to the American Society. What about the Naval Shore Station Cancellation Society? I imagine that went by the wayside at some point as well, did it?
It was either just after the war or during the war. I've forgotten now when it was. It might have been like, for some reason, 46 stands in my mind, but
So
they didn't last very long.
Okay, so at this point, there are no other putative societies around. It's really us.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
There was even a maritime society at one point in time, but they folded up 20 years ago.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks again.
Any other questions?
Just a comment. You mentioned in the global sense, it's doubtless true that there were relatively few philatelic covers from the Korean War. But Taze Nicholson did there were a whole lot of ships recommissioned for the war. And Taze did covers for a lot of those. And I knew this initially because my father was CO of the attack transport Menard when it was recommissioned for the Korean War. And I have a number of Taze cachets addressed to him aboard the ship. I corresponded with Taze about this. Did he send covers to the ship? And so what he did was when he sent a number of covers to a ship for the recommissioning cancels, it would include 10 or 15 just to give to the mail clerk to deal with as wanted. And the Menard's mail clerk seems to have done several examples for his CO, and then they wound up in my collection. So, they weren't covers from Korean waters philatelic, but they were Korean War related naval philatelic covers.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I misspoke, but yes, I agree. Anyone else have anything?
Well done.
Thank you, Mel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next month, the presentation will be simply St. Patrick's Day naval covers. So it'll be a couple of days after St. Patrick's Day, and it's not going to necessarily be historical or lots of knowledge, but just some fun covers to look at.
Could be hysterical rather than historical.
Yeah, could well be. Lori, what's your April presentation on?
We are going to do Victims of the Divine Wind.
Okay, so that covers April, and then in May, we're going to hear from Greg and Randy on the Asiatic Fleet.
With luck.
No, wrong attitude. It is a positive attitude. You will be discussing the Asiatic Fleet. We will have a wonderful time.
Well, and plan B for that, because I haven't been in touch with Randy, is I can try to do what you've just done. And I did in '99, I did a exhibit of my father's entire career in covers. And I could probably recycle that into a PowerPoint presentation if need be. So one way or the other.
Excellent. I have to go. I have an appointment actually at 4 o'clock. I have to leave for. Steve, this was really wonderful. I really enjoyed that. I hope everyone else did, and hopefully we'll see you all next month. And I am signing off.
Nice job, Lori. Nice job, Steve.
Thank you, everybody. See you in March.
Thank you again.